Hello, this is Dan Klein for the January 2025 EJW podcast, and I'm excited to talk with Professor Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia University. Thank you for talking with me, Professor Sachs. How are you
Happy,
today?
Happy New Year.
Thank you. Thanks for being with us. Um, Professor Sachs's influence is enormous and his areas of research are very diverse. I'll give a bio, but let me say something about why I'm so excited to be talking to Professor Sachs. I've become highly interested in the deep state and American foreign policy and watch channels on which he is a regular guest, including Judge Napolitano's Judging Freedom and the Duran. For today, I hope to ask Professor Sachs about being an economist, the economics profession, his own ideological outlook, and whether he feels he's undergone any kind of ideological migration, and foreign policy, especially with respect to Russia. Does that sound good, or is there anything else you think we should try to get to today?
That sounds like a lot of ground, so let's get into it.
All right. So, for my own benefit, if no one else's, I've got a bio to read. Professor Sachs grew up in the Detroit metro area and went to Harvard for 3 econ degrees, then a faculty appointment, and tenure and full professorship at, get this, the age of 28. During 2 decades while on the faculty at Harvard, he led the Harvard Institute for International Development and Center for International Development, advised Bolivia in a profound way, then Poland, and then other post-communist societies. He is identified with the expression shock therapy for transitioning economies. With Andrew Warner, he formulated an influential theory about openness and property rights being sufficient to become a convergent economy. In 2002, he moved to his current home institution, Columbia, to lead the Earth Institute, where he founded the Millennium Villages Project and then the Center for Sustainable Development. In 2005, he published the blockbuster The End of Poverty and followed that up with Commonwealth: Economics for a Crowded Planet. He's been an advisor on econ and development issues to officials all over the world, it seems. In 2012, he published a book about domestic U.S. issues subtitled Reawakening American Virtue and Prosperity, and in 2018, another on domestic issues, which featured a foreword by Bernie Sanders. In 2020, he published a deeply historical book titled The Ages of Globalization. I have to mention that I looked up Professor Sachs's Google site count, and it's about 171,000, which is a heck of a lot. Back in 2014, we see perhaps a marker, perhaps you can tell me whether this is right, of a transition from a focus on ending poverty to a focus on ending war, with a book subtitled JFK's Quest for Peace. And in 2020, another book, A New Foreign Policy, Beyond American Exceptionalism. Professor Sachs is now profoundly counter-narrative on several fronts, most especially foreign policy. There's so much in your career, Professor Sachs. Is there anything you'd like to add by way of background?
Thank you for that summary. That's very nice.
All right. So about just being an economist, I figured this was a good opportunity, and since we're Econ Journal Watch, let me share a thought and then a question.
Yep.
I see a certain parallel between you and one of my heroes, Thomas Schelling, in that both of you seem more interested in being an advisor and hence really making a difference than a celebrated economist. Like you both have the attitude, I'm going to do things my way, and if my fellow economists don't like it, so be it. One difference from Schelling is that you advise not only government elites, but the public at large, something which Schelling did to a much lesser extent and much less outspokenly. Any thoughts on that comparison?
Well, I appreciate it because Tom Schelling was a wonderful economist and a wonderful person and a wonderful friend whom I knew at Harvard. So I naturally like you're linking me with him. He was indeed a government advisor. I think a difference for me is that I've advised mostly governments in other places of the world, not the US government, although I kibitz with the US government and have done so relentlessly for more than 40 years. But my formal advisory activities have been around the world. And that, of course, also for me explains some of my attitudes towards the US. I tend to see the US from the outside looking in rather than from the inside looking out. And I've never been, nor have I ever desired to be an advisor to the US government per se. I got interested in the world at large early on. I believe in a world of peace and prosperity. And so I tend not to be very interested in one country's patriotic appeals versus another, but rather how we can function together.
Yeah, that all makes sense. Any thoughts on the idea that you're going to do it your own way, and whether your fellow economists like it and kind of like
Well,
applaud it? Like that's secondary.
look, life's short. I want to get
Yeah,
things right. That's my main idea. I
yeah.
think trying to be as accurate as I can be, trying to understand things as accurately as I can be, experiencing things on the ground has made a big difference for me. One of my life-changing experiences was being engaged in a practical problem solving for the first time at a high level in 1985 in Bolivian hyperinflation. And when I was involved and I made some policy recommendations that I think worked out pretty well, my colleagues said, well, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? Which was fair enough, but I found the points, frankly, quite naive because I was there watching and participating close up, and they were kibitzing from several thousand miles away. And I found it quite limiting. So my whole intellectual strategy for it's now basically 40 years from 1985 till today has been to keep one foot firmly in academia and conceptualization and theory, and one foot very much planted in practice in the world. And each one helps me to inform the other side. So theory and practice, to my mind, are completely complementary. They are not in the slightest way even conceivably antagonistic. And at least for me, I couldn't figure things out theoretically. I need the practical evidence in front of me, and then I try to make sense of it.
Yeah.
I very much like the old expression attributed to Walter Heller, the policy economist of the 1960s, who purportedly said that an economist is someone who, when he sees that something works in theory, in practice, tries to find out if it works in theory. And I like that direction of logic. See if it works in something that's working in practice, try to conceptualize it and understand it. So in any event, that's been my approach to knowledge and understanding. Be deeply engaged in practical problem solving and try to conceptualize what it is you're actually doing in that
Yeah.
process.
I think that fueled Schelling's great insights and developments. So who are some of your favorite economists? First pre-20th century. Anybody you want to mention?
Well, I'm a confirmed Aristotelian, so though Aristotle is not typically counted as an economist, he did, of course, write about economics. He wrote about everything. And so I'm a great admirer of Aristotle in many different dimensions. I'm a huge fan of Adam Smith because I think both the 1759, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, and 1776, The Wealth of Nations, are two of the finest books about society ever written. I have my quibbles and qualms, and also my observations about ways that Smith has been interpreted or reinterpreted subsequently. But of course, he's an absolute giant. There are many giants. We all need them as our guides. In the 20th century, by far, the economist that I have most admired and tried to emulate in certain ways is John Maynard Keynes. By emulate, I don't mean to be Keynes. I mean to follow the methodology that he advised, that he prescribed. And one of the most notable points about his methodology in his eulogy to Alfred Marshall was to say that an economist should be a multifaceted individual that could touch theory and practice together, that could be both mathematical and practical, that could be, I think, I don't remember his exalted language exactly, but, reaching to the heavens, but also as down to earth as the politician. And I really like that idea of the mix of talents that is useful for good economics.
Is there anyone else in the 20th century you want to?
Well, I had two absolute geniuses as immediate influences on me. Being a student in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Paul Samuelson absolutely dominated the scene. He was just a great genius, an absolute remarkable mind. And his brother-in-law and fellow genius,
Soul? No.
Kenneth Arrow, the absolute, probably the greatest polymath that I met in the economics profession, because while Samuelson knew everything about economics, about history, about every theorem, about every personality in economics, Arrow seemed to know everything about everything about everything. And when I was an undergraduate student at Harvard, I invited Arrow to lunch because we would be encouraged to invite our faculty to lunch. And he asked me about my courses, which included some literature courses, some history courses, some anthropology courses, some math courses, and so forth. Every single thing I touched on, he went off into a complete, absolute, remarkable discussion at depth. And it was a lasting impression. And I had another similar impression walking with him in Venice, actually, at a conference. And every street corner, he told the history of some event, some revolution, some personality. He was just an incredible polymath, and both of them were extremely kind people, and had a huge inspirational impact on me, I would say, as a young student. Simon Kuznets was another wonderful individual who a bit took me under his wing when I was an undergraduate, and I would visit him at his home. He was an emeritus professor at that point, and he told me about the origins of GDP accounting and the purposes. And remember, Jeff, GDP is not a measure of well-being, and it was never meant to be a measure of well-being. And many lessons. Ken Galbraith was also extraordinarily kind giant of a mentor for me early on in my undergraduate days. So for me, coming from Detroit, arriving at Harvard, and immediately falling into the orbits of Samuelson, Solow, Arrow, Kuznets, uh, uh, and many others was, of course, such a life-changing, wonderful experience.
Wow. Thanks for sharing. You mentioned a bit about how economists shouldn't be kind of confined to their field, and that certainly had been a trend for, I would say, centuries, right? But not necessarily a good one, I gather you feel.
Well, there's room for specialization and there's room for generalization. I'm a generalist, and
Hmm.
others are specialists, and you need both. You need very deep dives, and you need people who can help put the pieces together.
Yeah.
I spend most of my time at the intersection of fields, I would say,
Yeah.
trying to understand the intersection of Earth's physical systems, engineering, the macroeconomy, the social economy, and so forth. I've spent 25 years trying to build a field which I call sustainable development, which comes from the
Mm.
phrase sustainable development, but I want it to be an academic field, meaning that it is an integrated study of physical, engineered, political, economic, and social systems and how they fit together. Because I think we need that kind of broad understanding. Maybe it's what an ecologist does for the natural world, not a specialist on any particular species, but on how they cohere together. And for me, that is important. There is a trade-off. There's no question. Economists are right. There's such thing as scarcity, the scarcity of our attention, our skill sets, and so forth. And if you become a generalist, you gain certain skills and you forego others. And if you are a deep specialist, you can make very deep dives into areas, but you hope that your deep dive interconnects in a meaningful way with the rest of our world. So I've chosen the generalist approach,
Hmm.
and for me it also means uh, a sense of that I'm a permanent grad student because
Hmm.
I'm always learning new fields, always trying to learn new fields, always believing, yeah, I'm going to spend some time trying to understand something that I really
Yeah.
didn't have my professional training in or my publications in, but that is absolutely important to get right. And I led an organization called the Earth Institute at Columbia for around 15 years, which was hundreds of uh, leading scholars from across Columbia's faculties, but including climate scientists, civil engineers, uh,
Hmm.
economists, political scientists, psychologists, sociologists. And a lot of my fun was learning a bit about each of their fields, but also gaining the unique opportunity when a question, say, about climatology came up, to be able to speak directly with one of the world's leading climatologists to get the lowdown on the topic, or with engineers who could help me to understand how the power grid works and so forth. And having that kind of generalist knowledge is really important, in my view, for a lot of the core policy making that needs to be done in the world today. And it's generally lacking that kind of general integrative knowledge.
Hmm. Hmm. Any general remarks about the econ profession today that you'd like to share?
Well, I wanted to do better in many ways. I wanted to be more problem solving. I wanted to be more grounded in uh, ideas of what is a good society. I think it can't just be, as Milton Friedman wrote in 1953 a positive field where the goal is prediction above everything else. I think it has to be a field oriented towards the good more than it is actually. I often think, because my wife is a medical doctor and I watched her train in medical school and through her residencies and specializations and so forth, what would it be like if a medical school said, we study disease, we try to predict the course of disease, but our job isn't really to intervene and choose something called health or not health. It would be quite interesting. You'd go into the hospital and the doctor would predict, well, you'll be dead in 7 days. We have very good forecasting capacities. Well, what about saving me, doctor? No, that's not really my field. That's a value judgment. I don't want to get too involved in that. I find that approach to economics not sensible.
Okay. I'd like to ask about your ideology and whether if you feel it's undergone any change. And this is rather apart from foreign policy, just to kind of imagine more of an economist looking at the national economy, domestic policy. And there's a lot in your career that points in favor of individual liberty and free markets. On the other hand, in a recent podcast, you called Franklin Roosevelt our greatest president, and yet you get on great with Napolitano. That's where you said that, and I believe he's a libertarian. It's great to get on with everybody. It's not like a big deal. Just like with Tucker Carlson, in an interview with him, you said the Biden administration has been the worst of our governments in modern history. And you said very favorable things about Rand Paul as well as Tulsi Gabbard. And you kind of express a hope about the incoming Trump presidency in terms of a foreign policy change. So, I'm not trying to be tricky or anything.
No, I understand.
Yeah. And
first, I don't like the normal categories.
Yeah, I just want to add, just from my part, I don't see a lot of, if you will, very like you talked about your amazing pedigree at Harvard and everything, and like a lot of people like you who would say that about the Biden administration publicly. So I just wonder, like, what do you make of yourself?
First, the main change is I know more than I used to, because when I got into economics, I knew almost nothing. And in fact, I got into economics because I was kind of amazed at how little I understood about almost anything about our economy or our society. And I wanted to understand. So this has been now a 53-year venture because I started as a student in 1972 in economics in the fall of 1972. And I'm still learning. So this is the first point. Second, I'm skeptical of all labels. They are, of course, some people do pride themselves on bearing a particular label. I'm skeptical that there's very much depth in that approach. Words like capitalism, socialism, liberty, market economy, and so forth, they can mean a lot of different things. These are big, vague terms. Third, as an Aristotelian, as I mentioned, Aristotle praised a mixed form of government when he came down to his analytics of politics in the politics. He talked about government of the one, government which could be of a good or bad form. It could be a monarchy or it could be a despot. A government of the few, it could be of a good form, an aristocracy, government of the best, or an oligarchy, or a government of the many. It could be mob rule or it could be republicanism. He made 2 points. One, the formal structures don't define the quality of the outcomes. This is one of his genius points, that it's debating the formal structure of the economy leaves a lot out. Second, he advocated a mixed form of government. Take some of the government of the ones, some of the government of the few, some of the government of the many, because different kinds of problems require different kinds of organization. This is true of an economy. One of the things I learned from and love about Paul Samuelson's approach to economics was he said there are private goods and there are public goods. And he defined rigorously the difference of the two, which I think is one of the most eye-opening developments of economics in the 20th century, that we could actually identify in which cases individual behavior would lead to desirable outcomes, such as Pareto efficiency, and in which cases that would not be true. And those are partly due to the technical character of a particular good or service, whether it's rival or non-rival, whether it's excludable or non-excludable. So I think we owe a lot to Samuelson for clarifying these basic concepts. And I always loved the field of public economics in particular, because public economics defined when do markets work well, when don't they work well, when should we use auctions, when should we use normal market mechanisms, why are there firms? All these great classic questions of the 20th century show that the economy is much more than a convex set of preferences and technological transformation curves that lead to the first and second welfare theorems. So in this sense, we need a richer institutional understanding. So that's why I find all of the kind of tendentious ideological discussions off base. And it's interesting for me. I advised the Polish government in 1989. I think I made good recommendations. They set and staged decades of rapid economic catch-up for Poland, which was exactly the idea that I had in mind. So it wasn't an ex post observation. It was an ex ante desideratum. But when I made the recommendations, they thought, well, this guy's a super liberal free market economist, shock therapy, extreme liberalism. And I said, come on, are you kidding? That's not me at all. But if you start with the Soviet economy, what the hell are you going to do? You're going to liberalize. If you start the other direction, maybe you're going to go in the other direction. Okay. So I found myself constantly typecast or misunderstood or oversimplified in the public media. Okay, who can, no time to complain, but just as a sociological observation, what you're painted as is often pretty weird compared to what you believe. The idea that, well, I was a free market radical and then I had a conversion on the road to Damascus when shock therapy failed and tried to make amends. Many absolutely absurd quasi-biblical allegories were stated for the few who actually cared about what I was saying.
So you don't, okay, and so you don't report any particular change in policy view, whether it's, especially I guess domestic policy we're talking about.
Not on the left-right spectrum to the extent,
or just
that
like
is
interventionist, big government, small government.
No, because I was trained. First, I went into economics to solve problems, so it was already a bit of an interventionism, I would say, as a basic philosophical position, that the world has problems and that they are solvable and should be solved. So that is a kind of maintained hypothesis for me. Second, I grew up in the milieu of the neoclassical synthesis of Samuelson and Keynes. Keynes said, you have to intervene to make the economy work. Samuelson said, yes, but don't overdo it. Markets are pretty good. And then for me, a kind of, blindingly fresh and clear insight was this public and private good distinction. Of course, it has many, many levels of sophistication to it, but the basic idea that certain things you leave to the market, other things you don't leave to the market, was not only part of my upbringing, very Samuelsonian in Cambridge, Mass. In the 1970s, but I think fundamentally correct, which is this is how a complex world is. You need often complex solutions. I would say two other big influences on me. One was at a distance, because I never met him, Jan Tinbergen, who received the Nobel Prize for targets and instruments. And that's a great idea. You set targets, you understand the economic structure, and thereby you set your instruments at the right levels. You turn the dials and the levers in the right way to achieve your targets. This is a fundamentally good, smart idea in my view. So I was very Tinbergian all my life. Another influence for me was travel, seeing other places. And one of the places I went to early on was Scandinavia. And boy, I liked what I saw. High prosperity, social democracy. There was no poverty. Everybody had health care. It seemed, whoa, how'd they figure this out? And private markets, big business, free trade. What a mix. Who thinks of Sweden, social democracy, as a free trade country? But of course it's a free trade country. Of course it's a country where the government doesn't intervene and to say don't lay off workers. It says absolutely lay off workers so that they move to more productive activities. So I came back from a trip to Sweden after my undergraduate degree, and I went to my advisor, who was Martin Feldstein, I'd say on the whole a free market oriented economist. And I said, Marty, I'd like to write my dissertation on social democracy. And he said, nah, that's not very interesting. Go down to MIT and study international monetary economics, which I did to great benefit with Rudiger Dornbusch. And I became an international finance economist instead. But this is all to say, I was interested in social democracy. I was 25, and I found it very compelling. And in Poland in 1989, when I was asked about my supposed free market nostrums, in an interview in the New Yorker, I said to the reporter in the fall of 1989, on the verge of shock therapy, so-called, that the country I admire the most is Sweden. So the idea that this is some conversion from, hyperliberalism to interventionism is a biographical, ahistorical, let me put it that way.
Thank you. It's very fascinating. I'm sitting in the Stockholm area right now.
Oh, okay.
So,
Great.
yeah. So I'd like to turn then, I guess. I mean, I follow so much of the discourse on those channels that I mentioned and the foreign policy stuff. So I can't resist trying to talk to you about a little bit
Sure.
about that. Yeah. It seems to me that, I think this resonates with you, but also from John Mearsheimer, Glenn Deason, other guests on Napolitano and the Duran, that a lot of dominant Western government elites, if I can put it that way, are actually kind of bent on regime change in Russia and breaking up the Russian Federation, kind of if maybe peeling off, republics at a time. What would you agree with that?
Of course. I think one of the things of growing up, and by that I mean reaching the age of 70, which I've reached, is understanding one's own country more clearly. It takes decades. When you live within a milieu, it's actually not easy to understand the immediate milieu you're living within. It may be easier to understand a rural African village or a highland economy in the Altiplano in the Andes in Bolivia than it is to understand your own society. And I did not understand American foreign policy for much of my career in depth. I had skepticism early on because even as a 14-year-old, I was marching against the Vietnam War. And I grew up in the era of the assassinations of JFK, RFK, and Martin Luther King. And in the Watergate era. So I don't want to say I was, naive and Pollyannish, but the extent to which the U.S. relentlessly, as a government, resorted to assassinations, coups, and wars of choice is something that I only came to understand step by step. You'd learn about
Yeah.
Mossadegh in Iran in 1953. It's a learning experience. It's not something I was taught in class, that's for sure. Or Lumumba's assassination, largely at the hands of the CIA in cahoots with the Belgians in 1961. And then you find out step by step by step that there are dozens and dozens of these cases. And then you come to learn, or I came to learn at least only over time, how deeply systemic it is and how it became completely embedded in American foreign policy institutionally through, I'd say, most notably the 1947 National Security Act, which established the CIA as a secretive army of the President of the United States that could do almost anything beyond the law without accountability. And
That's
this is, to my mind, the reality of U.S. foreign policy. And when you think about the ability of presidents to bring us into wars, to overthrow governments, to assassinate foreign politicians, it is a tyrannical state. It's not a democratic state. I've, of course, over the years came to know many members of Congress. They don't do their job because institutionally they're suborned, they're bribed not to, they're extricated if they try to do their job. There's been only one real congressional oversight of the CIA, and that was 50 years ago this year, the Church Committee. For 50 years, there has not been accountability of the Central Intelligence Agency. So does the US government try to overthrow other governments nonstop? Has it aimed to basically divide up Russia after 1991 in the same way that it tried to end the Soviet Union between 1945 and 1991? Absolutely, yes. And it's spelled out in many places, but you have to look for them. And you have to know where to look. And when you do look, it's not a happy story.
Yeah. Do you tune in at all to Michael Benz?
No, I mean, I know who he is, but I don't, unfortunately, given time constraints, I don't unfortunately have the chance to tune into too many other, too many.
He's awesome on knowing so much of the institutional play-by-play, blow-by-blow detail. I really find him worthwhile and I recommend him. He calls it the Department of Dirty Tricks, like the
Yeah.
CIA.
You know,
And then,
one thing that I think is, for me, I work with governments all over the world. Of course, I work on economics. I don't work on intelligence or security issues. But I have the chance to speak with people all over the world all the time. Much of what is called secretive or covert, of course, is completely known. It's just denied. What we mean by a
Yeah.
covert operation is that it's a denied operation, not that it's hidden from view. The coup is there in broad daylight. Sometimes it couldn't be more obvious. It's just that the US government says, me? I didn't do it. And so in this sense, you definitely hear a lot.
And the New York Times says it the same way.
The New York Times is useless, unfortunately,
Mhm.
except if you want to know what theater to go to or what play to see. Other than that, useless in terms of trying to
Any
understand foreign policy.
A big point that I learned from Ben's and that he drives home and illustrates really nicely is that the dirty tricks playbook has been turned on inward, has been turned on us with the censorship, persecution, the whole 9 yards, propaganda, intimidation, and so on, lawfare. Well, I guess lawfare is an aspect of it. And I just wonder if that's like how you feel about it, that the moral attitude, the moral regard for people outside the country has been very terrible and disgraceful, and that kind of almost moral rot is now like very much infecting our domestic politics. Does that make sense?
I think there's no question that, to use a maybe a cliched analogy, the Roman Republic became the Roman Empire, and the American Republic became the American Empire. And
Hmm.
I think that this is true. And imperial power does not look so well
Yeah.
on internal threats as well. And I'm of the school that JFK and RFK and MLK were taken out by forces that included parts of the U.S. Government. I
Hmm.
don't think that this is. I've spent decades now, like probably many of my generation, to try to understand those events. And I think what is absolutely undeniable is that the forensics are contrary to the official story. And second, that there was never a serious investigation of these assassinations. And that tells you a lot, to my mind. And aside from motive and opportunity, just the sheer behavior of senior reaches of the US government, the fact that CIA documents regarding the Kennedy assassination are still not released 62 years later, despite repeated calls by Congress for their release. And Biden, again, in the long list of presidents, kept secret documents from decades ago. It tells you something.
Um, Another question for you. Is there anything to the idea, my idea, that the more you realized this about, if you will, the deep state, foreign policy, and the influence of sort of those considerations on economics, generally speaking, like does this perhaps in some way explain, because I see kind of a shift in your career from a focus on poverty to a focus on peace. Does that make any sense? I'm just kind of conjecturing.
Well, I would say a couple of things. First, if your goal is to uh, improve the world, if it sounds, I hope that's not too highfalutin, but that is my goal, to do what I can in my
Sure.
way during my career. And so as I've said, I view economics as a problem-solving field and a normative field to try to help make things better. Well, the truth is war is a terrible inefficiency. Let me just say, it's just extraordinarily frustrating to try to be building something and to have trillions of dollars invested in destroying it. And so it's not only maddening, it's, to my mind, verging on a kind of insanity. Second, the nature of our war is terrifying in my view, in that we are closer to nuclear Armageddon than at any time during the entire nuclear age. I lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis. We're in a kind of prolonged Cuban Missile Crisis right now. We're actually firing missiles, US personnel at Russia. Can this possibly be right? The answer is no. We're actually talking openly about war with China by 2027. And there are a lot of people in Washington who are proudly talking about that. And we have official documents that we must prepare for war with China by 2027 and so forth. And all of this in nearly the complete absence of diplomacy, of trying to solve the problems, trying to understand why would that be? How could we avoid this? Are we really on a sane course? So this is, for me, simply one of the reasons why this became a priority for me. When you do reach the doomsday clock at 90 seconds to midnight, this is not a small matter. And it's one worthy of attention. But then I realized another thing, which is I'd been there to these places. I was an advisor to Mikhail Gorbachev. I was an advisor to Boris Yeltsin. I was an advisor to Leonid Kuchma, the second president of Ukraine. I've seen the Maidan. I've seen the post-coup government. I've met these people. I know them. And so that also changes the stakes for me. I've seen it with my own eyes, this misbehavior. I've had presidents say to me, they're gonna take me out. And then the CIA literally marched them out. I'm talking about President Aristide of Haiti, who said to me, they're going to take me out, Jeff. And I laughed and, no, Mr. President, we're going to solve this, and so on. But not only could I not help when they froze the IMF lending, when they froze the World Bank lending, part of the normal playbook to bring down a poor government, but then they marched the president of Haiti out to an unmarked plane and flew him, I think it was 23 hours, to the Central African Republic, and then denied that the US launched a coup. And the New York Times, by the way, wouldn't even cover it. I called the reporter whom I knew in Port-au-Prince. I said, well, are you going to cover it? She said to me, and I'm quoting, my editor is not interested. So when you see these things before your own eyes, it's not reading them in the history books. It's not making a surmise. It makes you sick, frankly. And it also raises the stakes. And that's why I've gotten more and more involved on these geopolitical issues. It's also, I might say, if you're working on issues like environmental protection or poverty reduction, it's just damn annoying that we're spending trillions of dollars on destroying things and killing people and not focusing on these other problems. And so this is also in my way saying, could we clear away the underbrush so that we could get onto things that really can improve the lives of people?
Getting back to Russia, I believe you feel that much, if not most, of what is said in the major media in the West is false about Russia.
It's laughable. It's tragic also. It's just pure propaganda. And the words come down from on high. The word of choice after 2022 was unprovoked. It's not such a common word, but the New York Times used the word unprovoked, by my count, 26 times in the first year of the special military operation that commenced on February 24th, 2022. It's not an accident that that word was used repeatedly. It was the word of choice. Of course it wasn't provoked. The one thing that the paper might have done was run one story to say, well, what are the antecedents of what happened on February 24th, 2022? Why did Putin decide that Russia would have this military operation? What had Putin put on the table with the US on December 15th, 2021? What had happened with previous agreements like the Minsk II agreement? What about that coup on February 22nd, 2014 that brought down Viktor Yanukovych? Well, my experience with the New York Times is they would not run one analytical story or one op-ed that would even raise these questions, much less present the evidence. And so this is, to my mind, simply journalistic dishonesty.
And they blame Russia for so many things. It's like the go-to blame for like something that's wrong, and sometimes even, our own U.S. officials' deeds.
Well, there's a tip.
Russia,
There's
Russia, Russia.
also, yes, we know it from social psychology. We actually have theories of it from evolutionary biology called two-level selection, that we're very good at loving ourselves and very good at hating the other. And so we choose the evidence accordingly. We filter the evidence. We have confirmation bias. We have every kind of behavioral economics bias in a particular direction. And we have pervasive and nonstop media bias. Last week, there was an article after the tragic, probably accidental shooting down of the Azerbaijan airplane, which had flown into a conflict zone in Russia, where Ukraine was attacking with drones and Russia was counterattacking with anti-drone missiles, and quite possibly, though we don't know to this moment, the civilian aircraft was shot down by a Russian anti-drone missile or by the shrapnel from some related explosion. Anyway, the Washington Post columnist wrote, well, this is basically what uncivilized countries do. And it's just Russia's uncivilized. They're the barbarians. We're the civilized country. Of course, the whole concept of who's civilized and who's barbarian goes back about 3,000 years. It's a trivial point that one side is always the civilized side and the other side's always the barbarian, uncivilized side. But do we have to read this baloney in our press from grown-ups who are writing these columns? I generally don't. But once in a while I do, and then I remember why I generally don't.
Why are Western elites, governmental elites, like so bent on breaking up Russia?
Well, first of all, I think it has been our strategy since 1945. As soon as World War II ended, the whole U.S. security system, even before there was a CIA, when there was just an OSS, and when there was still the operational committees of the U.S. military, said we're going to have a war with Russia or Soviet Union shortly. By 1952 was the estimate then. We already from that moment, even before that, had refused to share information about the atomic weapons development and so forth with the Russians. The idea was the Bolsheviks were our enemy and we're going to take them on next. And the CIA was basically created with that long-standing mission to keep out leftist governments, to overthrow leftist governments, and to topple the Soviet Union. What's interesting is that when the Soviet Union ended in December 1991, the mission continued. It was just redefined as now we have to dismember or decolonize or otherwise weaken Russia in the same way as the Soviet Union. We're almost there. And the game plan became surround Russia with NATO, weaken Russia around the margins, double down on our strategy that dates back to Zbig Brzezinski in 1979 on funding jihadists to weaken Russia's periphery, because that's the Islamic periphery around Russia, and funding jihadists to fight the Russian Orthodox Russians was a long-standing CIA operation. We started it up in Chechnya, in the Balkans again, and so forth. And so this never ended. This is where I came in individually into the story.
But why? But the question is why? It's like Russia, in some sense, said, Gorbachev was kind of like, yeah, I guess you guys are right. And the West couldn't take yes for an answer. But
Oh,
why?
there's such a wonderful line of Henry Kissinger. I'm going to read it because I pulled it up on my screen to quote it. In a 1994 interview, actually December 5, 1994, on PBS with Robert McNeil. McNeil asked, why are we expanding NATO, for heaven's sake? And Kissinger and McNeil says, my understanding is there are no borders that are threatened at the moment. Even the existing borders of NATO are not threatened at the moment. Why are we expanding NATO, he's asking. And Kissinger says, the existing borders of NATO can't be threatened because they are now adjoining friendly countries. So there's nobody there with any capacity to threaten the borders, at least not from the East. So the problem is whether the new states of Eastern Europe, the former Soviet satellites, should be included into NATO. And then Kissinger says, if we are reluctant to antagonize the Russians today, when they're weak, it's an illusion to think that somewhere 3-4 years down the road, we can suddenly move in that direction. It's mind-boggling to me. It's almost hilarious. What's he saying? He's saying, of course we should antagonize them. Either we do it when they're weak or we should do it when they're strong, but he takes it for granted. There's no threat, but we should antagonize them.
It's amazing, but we're like repeating the thing to be explained. So is it like what underlies this,
The idea that I think traditionally there are three claims for state motivation. One claim is fear. So you act in a way because you feel threatened. Well, Kissinger explains, no, we're not doing exactly that. This isn't fear. The second is glory in one form or another. Alexander the Great really did want to conquer the entire world. He thought he was the son of Zeus. He was told that by the soothsayer in Egypt, and he went out to prove it to the world. And the United States doesn't put it exactly that way, but it puts it that we have a mission in the world, the same mission civilisatrice of the French Empire or the civilizing mission of the British Empire. We are America. We are the liberal leaders of the free world. We will make the world safe in our image. And people, grown-ups, again, although not in a grown-up way, in my view, take this stuff seriously, like Robert Kagan, liberal hegemony. We just should run the world. That's the best way for the world. And then the third is the grubbier motives attached to this. Lindsey Graham, who I regard as the stupidest senator in the U.S. Senate, and he comes along and confirms my thoughts with high frequency, says, well, we've got to fight in Ukraine. They have $10 trillion of minerals. This is, we got to control them so the Russians and the Chinese don't control them. So the fight over resources plays a role, or the perception of that fight. There are two kinds of resources at stake. One is the direct war as business resources. The military-industrial complex, after all, is a $1.5 trillion a year operation.
And I'm sure a lot of it goes in all sorts of
By
directions.
the way, it goes to fund the think tanks all along the East Coast. This is
Yeah.
every think tank. My own university, the think tanks in Washington, they're funded by these companies. They're funded by the U.S. government. This is a national effort, after all. So I think the warmongering, the military-industrial complex, the crude perception that those resources are ours to be taken, the glory of running the world, the purported or claimed threats, although Kissinger made clear there are no threats. We should just antagonize them when they're weak, so we don't have to do it when they're strong. These are all motives. There's no single motive for this, except to say that war is a state activity, and running a complex state is a coalition of forces. It's not one person. It's not huge, but it's military contractors, it's politicians, it is ideologues, it's private companies doing business alongside. It is a coalition. And structurally, the permanence and unaccountability of the CIA, in my mind, is the single biggest structural liability of the US system, because we created an institution literally outside of legal control, and did so knowingly and deliberately, and to the regret of, famously, of Harry Truman himself, who signed the National Security Act, to the fear of Dwight D. Eisenhower, who warned us of the military-industrial complex, and in my view, to the demise of JFK and RFK, who I think perished for their opposition to this secretive, unaccountable state within a state.
One last question. So I really can't imagine having a conversation along these lines with any other. I don't know any other economist, much less a very prominent and effective and influential one. I mean, millions and millions of watch you, I bet you, every week. If maybe that's a bit of an overstatement, but not too much. So how come, if you're right, and as you can see, I'm inclined to agree, like, why is it so difficult? There's two questions here. I still want to kind of know, like, why, if no one else does what you're doing, I don't know if the thing to be explained is why no one else does it, or why you're the one who does. But there's that question about, like, why are you different? And then that's kind of the bigger question of, it does seem so in your face, actually, so much of this, and the whole way they're raping democracy, like in Romania recently. It's just so in your face, and it's like, why is there such a strong taboo? And like, will there be like an awakening of some sort about all this?
It's a funny thing. It is in our faces to a shocking extent. You have Nord Stream blown up, for example, after President Biden says, if Russia invades, we will end it. And the reporter says, well, how? And he smirks, Biden smirks and says, well, we have our ways. And then it happens. And then everyone says, duh, it was the Russians. It was the Russians. And you watch all of these columnists and talking heads on television propounding idiocy. Another example, COVID. I chaired a major commission with serious people for the Lancet medical journal. And I wouldn't say I'm a public health expert, but as an economist, I've devoted a considerable amount of my time to understanding public health issues, and I led a major commission for WHO. I created the idea of the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria. I've been around this issue. I got into the COVID issue. It's crystal clear the US government has lied and lied and lied about the origin of the virus. We don't know every bit of the story. We know that there's a cover-up. That's what we know. Well, duh, it's natural, we're told. Come on. Can people behave even minimally honestly and rationally? Well, now, the public believes little that the government says. This is what's very interesting for me. When the government says Lee Harvey Oswald is the sole assassin of JFK, despite all the forensics, and Sirhan is the sole assassin of RFK, despite the fact that the coroner himself in the postmortem said it couldn't have been because the shot was fired from behind, not in front. The public doesn't believe any of this. It's just that the government doesn't have to say anything more. It just says that's the answer, pure and simple. We don't actually give a whether you believe it or not. Okay, this is our context on many different issues. They don't care that they're blowing smoke in our face. And we know it, but they don't care. Well, I don't know. Call me old-fashioned, but I sat through a lot of seminars in my youth where the idea was to poke holes in the mistakes of the paper presenter. That's how I was trained, that you challenge the claims and you try to look at them. And when the claims that are being made are not only on their face false, but extraordinarily dangerous because they're leading us closer and closer to the brink of nuclear annihilation, it's worth calling them out.
Yeah. Well, you're poking holes in very big narratives. I'm very grateful for what you're doing, and thank you for talking today.
Yeah, great to be with you. I appreciate it. And again, Happy New Year.
Thank you. Same to you. Let me just turn this off.